Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Wesley Whitaker and I'm one of your Ath Fellows this year. It was 6:30 a.m. when David Guianacosta stepped outside his house in Durham, North Carolina and headed to school. The 19-year-old had just began his second semester of senior year at Riverside High School, where teachers considered him an exemplary student. But that morning, Acosta never made it down the street, as two immigration agents waited in the driveway and commanded him to get in their vehicle. A Honduran native who fled gang violence for the U.S. at age 16, Acosta is among hundreds of Central American youths around the nation who have been targeted for deportation on their way to class or to work. Attendance dropped by 1/3 in some of the classes at Riverside High School in the days after Acosta's arrest. And this is part of a concerning trend of people in immigrant communities becoming isolated from public resources that are crucial to their safety and success, including the silence of victims of domestic abuse who fear contact with the police will result in their information being shared with immigration and customs enforcement. The Trump administration's approach to immigration has brought the question of what it means to belong in a community, political or otherwise, to the fore. Last night, Nancy Pelosi spent 8 hours on the Senate floor sharing stories of dreamers, individuals who immigrated to America as a child and were promised a path to citizenship by the Obama administration. Her message was clear: this is the only home they know. Our guest tonight will draw on the Declaration of Independence for guidance as we struggle to answer these and other questions surrounding citizenship and belonging. Danielle Allen is a professor in the government department at Harvard University and at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, as well as the director of Harvard's Edmond Safra Center for Ethics. She was appointed James Bryant Conant University Professor, Harvard's highest faculty honor in 2017. Professor Allen is a political theorist who has published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought, and is widely known for her work on justice and citizenship in both ancient Athens and modern America. Before joining Harvard, she was the first African-American faculty member to be appointed professor at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Allen is a contributing columnist for the Washington Post and the author of 6 books, 2 of which are on sale outside tonight, including Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality, which won the Francis Parkman Prize from the Society of American Historians and the Chicago Tribune's Heartland Prize for Nonfiction. She also chairs the Mellon Foundation Board of Trustees, is a past chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board, and has served as the trustee of both Amherst College and Princeton University. Professor Allen's Athenaeum presentation is co-sponsored by the Gould Center for Humanistic Studies. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please silence and put away your mobile devices at this time, and please join me in welcoming Professor Allen to the Athenaeum.
My thanks to Wesley, and thank you to Professor Fagan for the invitation, and to the fellows, Athenaeum fellows, for a lively dinner conversation. As Wesley's opening remarks suggested, the topic that garnered interest here over dinner was immigration. And so I will take up the challenge and do my best as a part of my remarks to explain how my time with the Declaration of Independence has guided me in my own efforts to think my way through the thorny questions surrounding the immigration debate. So I'll come back to that at the end of my remarks. We'll work our way there. And these are challenging times. It can seem counterintuitive in a moment where the sort of media is in a constant frenzy, accelerating our sort of heartbeats with every 24 hours a new version of a crisis, that we need to respond to. It can seem strange to return to old things, old texts, archaic 18th century formulations, and so forth. Yet as it happens, for pretty accidental reasons, I've been living with the Declaration of Independence for the last 17 years. Never would have thought that I would spend 17 years thinking about the Declaration of Independence. And with every year, it has become only a deeper and richer guide for me. So my purpose this evening is to invite you into reflection with me about the Declaration of Independence and the particular lessons it has for effective, equitable, and even self-protective citizenship in challenging times. That's my purpose this evening. But it can be a guide, it can be a valuable guide, only if it actually helps us with real questions that we have now. So I'm grateful for the challenged to take up the question of immigration and will do my best to share what the text has given me. How is it that I ended up accidentally living with the Declaration for this long? When I was a professor at the University of Chicago some time ago, I was lucky to be involved in a humanities program for low-income adults. Also, one of your faculty members, Professor Bob von Hallberg, taught in the same program in Chicago. And this was a course that sought to give people who didn't sometimes even have high school degrees the same quality of education that people sitting in places like this get. So they had literature and history and philosophy and art history. And as I wrestled with the question of how to ensure that these students working 2 jobs or sometimes out of work, struggling with childcare and city transportation and so forth, when I was trying to ensure that they could have the same kind of education as my University of Chicago students had, it was a hard problem to solve. How do you do that? And the answer I came to was there would be no compromise in terms of the quality of the material that the students were introduced to, the quality of the teaching experience, but we would read short texts. That was the solution. We would make the readings very short. So I thought, well, what's the shortest, best text I can think of? And that was the Declaration of Independence. 1,337 words. You can use it to teach history, you can use it to teach philosophy, you can use it to teach writing. What caught me by surprise was that my students reacted to the Declaration as an immediate source of inspiration for their own lives. It was directly empowering. And the teaching experiences I had in those night classes on the south side of Chicago were among the most moving of my career. And the reason was because, again, the students who had come to this class were there because they were trying to change their lives. They had been working too hard for too long in ways that didn't feel like they were getting anywhere, or their children were struggling, or people that they loved had died of diabetes and inadequate health care, or had died of gunshot wounds, or were languishing in prison. And they wanted things to be different. At the end of the day, the Declaration of Independence has at its core exactly that same urge, an assessment. The course of human events is not going in a good direction. I want a change. That's it, that basic human purposive intention to find a route to something better. That's what structures the Declaration of Independence, and that's what my students had. And they gave me the empowerment of the text by showing me how it resonated with them. So I'm inviting you to join me tonight in a similar period of reflection, because I think my belief is that the second sentence of the Declaration provides the most efficient account of the basic work of citizenship ever written. All right, so that's a big claim. So I'll put it to one of you to find something that does more efficiently than this. Okay, but so here's your test. You got to beat this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these, not a complete list, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle, and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, I know some of you have read my book, so you already knew the sentence was that long, but I'm guessing most of you didn't remember that the sentence was that long. We tend to think it stops after pursuit of happiness, and there's a long and complicated reason for that I can get into if you're interested. But the sentence, that's one sentence, okay? 5 truths. We hold these truths to be self-evident. People have rights. Here are some examples. Governments are instituted to secure those rights. And if the governments aren't doing their job, if they're not securing those rights, it's the right of the people. This is the most important part, to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on principle and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely, probabilistic judgment, to affect their safety and happiness. All right, so that last clause, that's the one I want you to think about and focus on. Lay the foundation on principle and organize the powers of government. That's a to-do list for citizenship. You've got to understand the core principles that you want to use to architect your society's basic commitments, to build a picture of where you're trying to go together. And then you have to understand the powers of government enough to figure out how to build institutions to make those principles real. We know they actually meant this as a to-do list because when they gathered in June of 1776 in Philadelphia, for the first time to consider the question of independence, they chose to set up several committees, okay? And I'll come back to these committees in a second. But the reason they did this, they gathered, and Richard Henry Lee proposed a resolution that they should declare independence. And they knew if they were going to take a step like that, revolution, high bar for decision making, they wanted unanimity. Unanimity. And they knew in June they didn't have it. So rather than calling the question, they said, we're going to procrastinate on this whole independence thing. Let's give it till July, all right? So we can see if we can get ourselves to unanimity. But in the meanwhile, just in case we do decide to vote for independence, here's what we have to do. We need a committee that's going to write a preamble to go with this resolution. Okay, that's the committee that starts drafting the Declaration. We need a committee to write the Articles of Confederation. And we need a committee to write treaties with France and Spain. So that committee drafting the preamble, they had the job of laying the foundation on some principles, all right? And the committees that were drafting the articles and the treaties, they were organizing the powers of government. The Declaration was a to-do list. This is what you gotta do if you wanna build a government or drive political change. Principles, organize the powers, right? Two things. It was enough of a to-do list that when they came to the Constitutional Convention, they repeated for themselves this question of principles and organizational form. They actually debated at the convention, did they need a new statement of basic principles? And they decided, no, they didn't. All they needed to do was rework how they organized the powers of government, hence the replacement of the articles with the Constitution, okay? At the end of the day, they weren't completely convinced that their original statement of principles held, and so they had to have the Bill of Rights added on, and they worked their way through that over time. And of course, our Supreme Court jurisprudence is a history of this country's reconsidering some of its basic principles, rethinking how to articulate those, all right? But that's it. Like, if you want just a one-clause description of what a citizen has to do, it's figure out the principles and understand the powers of government. Now, what does it take to prepare yourself to do that? That's why I'm glad to be invited at the invitation of the Humanities Center. You've got to have philosophy and religion and religious studies and history and political science and sociology and literature, which teaches you what happens when people act on different kinds of commitments and get into conflicts about them, okay? So, you need the humanities and social sciences, in other words. The only way to prepare yourself for the basic work of citizenship is with that set of disciplines, right? Now, but the lessons in that sentence don't end there. It's not just that there's this to-do list, figure out your principles, understand how to organize the powers of government. It actually gives us some thoughts about the principles, too. They're two really important ideas. I already pointed to one of them, right? This basic idea, people have rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So those are examples, okay? You gotta realize those are examples, which means right there they're saying, figure it out, people. We've taken a stab. Here's how far we've gotten. What do you think? Is healthcare a right, for example? That's a question of principle we are all currently debating. It might help our healthcare debate a little bit if we could realize that we could separate the debate into the question of principle, is there a right to healthcare, and then the question of organizational form. Maybe you say yes, maybe you say no. If you say yes, you've got the Affordable Care Act way of organizing stuff, you've got the Congress's Better Way plan, possible way of organizing the powers of government. There are a variety of different ways you could organize the powers of government to deliver on a right to health care if you decide that health care is a right. But let's go ahead and separate those two parts of the conversation. We might make some progress if we could do that. All right, so that's the first additional lesson. So when we think about principles, they're reminding us that they haven't finished the job. It's for us to do too. And so what is the job exactly that they've given us or reminded us that we have? We all have individual rights, We start there. But the reason we've built all these institutions together in the first place is to secure those rights and achieve our safety and happiness, right? The sentence doesn't end on me, it ends on us. So the challenge of the sentence is to learn how to connect individual rights and the pursuit of individual plans of action and purposes to a shared common purpose, our safety and happiness. Now, we all know that that's exceptionally hard to do. So what does it have to say about how we do that? To some extent, the entire document is making the case by example that you have to learn how to make your case for why the position that you're taking is good for us, And you're going to have to make that case, you have to test that case out with people who disagree with you. So you better equip yourselves with the skills of argument and persuasion. Oh, that's the humanities again, right? Okay, so this is why we need this kind of education. All right, so the Declaration then asks us to recognize that our task requires diagnosing whether our government is securing our rights, right? Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people, right? To figure out how to build foundational principle, organize the powers of government in such form as to us shall seem most likely to affect our safety and happiness. So that notion of what's most likely, this is almost the most important point. The best we can do is offer our best judgment without certainty, constantly working on that question in conditions of uncertainty, which means we've got to bring humility to the endeavor. All right? So alongside our capacity to talk about principles, alongside our capacity to understand how institutions get organized and how power gets structured through institutional architecture, alongside that, alongside our persuasive ability, and our ability to think about rights and to connect my own story to our story, we need to bring humility to the project, right? Now, it's often the case that when I set out to try to convince people that all you need to think about citizenship and doing right by your democratic responsibilities is the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence, the next thing people say to me is, but what about that Thomas Jefferson? Didn't he own slaves? And what about that language, all men are created equal? What about women? So I want to address those issues because they're important, and they often are obstacles to our ability to take the lessons of this text seriously. So let me start with the question of gender, and then I'll return to the issue of race and slavery. So Abigail Adams was a remarkable person, and her letters are as full of erudite political theory and philosophy as any of the published essays of the male founding fathers. Her husband, John Adams, served on the committee with Jefferson. In fact, John Adams was the real politico driving the work towards independence. And the committee of five who drafted the Declaration were Jefferson, Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. And Abigail had been urging John on in the course of independence for some time. She wrote to him in April after she'd learned that it looked like things were moving forward, and she was excited. She cheered him on. She was glad to hear of the developments, she said. But she also said, and now that you're thinking about independence and a new plan of laws, what about the ladies? She said, what's the place of the ladies in your new arrangement? And she continued, because so you men have had tyrannical power over women for centuries, and you've abused that. So are you going to take care of the women in your new arrangements? She said, and if you don't, we will foment for voice and representation, and we will foment a rebellion to achieve voice and representation, all right? So from the beginning, Abigail was criticizing or raising the question of what was going on with the place of women in the new political arrangements. John got criticism from somebody else too, in a similar way, about the issue of in the language of the time, Negroes and laborers. Somebody else wrote and said, well, what's the place for Negroes and laborers in the new arrangements that you're formulating? And in both cases, John wrote back something similar. What he wrote back was, the principles, happiness, life, liberty, and happiness, the notion that we're pursuing people's well-being, that applies to everybody. But the powers of government, the way in which we're going to organize the powers of government is in a patriarchal form. Men, white men with property, have the job of operating power in order to deliver on those rights for everybody, those goods for everybody. And Abigail was not convinced. Abigail said, well, again, we'll let you try one more time, but if you don't succeed, we'll foment rebellion. And sure enough, that's what happened. We got the suffragette movement and so forth. But the point of saying that is that the distinction between the principles of government and how we organize the powers of government helps see why we can take from our founding even at the same time as we modify our institutions. The principles were meant in a universal way. The language of men was meant as a universalizing term, and we know that because in the draft of the Declaration, Jefferson referred to men who are bought and sold at auction. And that was a category that included women, it included children, it included African Americans, obviously, because that's who he was talking about, all right? So the principles did mean to convey something universal, but the powers of government, the founders were committed to patriarchal forms of organization. And so we've been working since that time to reconsider how we organize the powers of government, to set them in relationship to our principles. Now, what about the issues of slavery and race? So there's a lot to be said here as well. And again, the same point I just made pertains. So in the draft of the Declaration, Jefferson described the people of Africa, distant Africans, as having sacred rights of life and liberty that King George had violated by protecting the slave trade. So the principles, again, applied even to Africans, but the powers of government, different question. But the more important thing to say about race and slavery in the Declaration is this. There are two compromises in the Declaration. We understand the Constitution to have compromises. We don't often see the compromises in the Declaration. But there are two. There's a good compromise and a bad compromise. The good compromise is a compromise around religion, all right? There is no language about religion in the Declaration that connects the Declaration to a specific religious tradition. It's all open-ended. Divine providence, right? Supreme judge, creator. Never connected to a single tradition. What's more, the language for religion was connected to a language for natural science. They talked about the laws of nature and nature's God. So even people who were deists and shading into atheists could sign on to the Declaration. So all the different flavors of religious view in the colonies were encapsulated in the capacious, open-ended language of the Declaration for Religion. Now, the slavery compromise has been harder to see, and it came in this way. There is a passage in the draft that condemns King George for the slave trade. I just alluded to it. And that got cut out by Congress, okay? That got cut out by Congress. That was a pro-slavery moment in the drafting of the Declaration. The anti-slavery moment comes in right in the beginning, that list of rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It wasn't life, liberty, and property. Yeah. And why not? Because in the fall of 1775, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, had decreed that any slave who ran away from the British and ran away from a plantation and fought for the British would be free. This radicalized the Virginians. It is what committed them to the cause of revolution. So we all have to acknowledge that a defense of slavery was a part of what drove the Revolutionary War. At the same time that it committed the Virginians to the war, it meant that they started complaining about King George for having violated their rights of property. So from the fall of 1775, a defense of the right to property became entangled with a defense of slavery. Alongside that argument, John Adams from Massachusetts, who never owned slaves and thought slavery was a bad thing, was trying to articulate a different view of how to describe the purposes of government. Happiness, he said, was the end of government, just as it was the end of individual men, all right? And over the course of the spring, he was arguing over and over and over again that happiness was the term they should use to define the core principles they were seeking to protect. And we see the compromise starting to take shape when in Virginia, in early May, the Virginians draft their own Declaration of Rights. And George Mason writes out life, liberty, acquiring and securing property, and pursuing happiness. He puts both the Southern property concept and the Northern happiness concept in the Virginian text. And then by July, with the Declaration, property is squeezed out. We get happiness, the position of those who don't want an endorsement of slavery in the Declaration. Okay, so that's the anti-slavery moment in the Declaration. And we know it was that. We know it was that because the very first people to make use of the Declaration for political purposes, other than the Revolution itself, were abolitionists. And they used the second sentence, okay? So Prince Hall, a free African American in Boston in 1777, January of 77, submitted a petition to the Massachusetts Assembly for emancipation. And by 1780, emancipation had been achieved in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Vermont. The Declaration coalesced the abolitionist movement. So our early history has multiple political traditions in it, not just the tradition of Jefferson, the slave owner, not just the tradition of white supremacy. The tradition of abolitionism goes right back to the beginning as well. And the slavery compromise in the Declaration, compromise though it was, provided a foundation for the abolitionist movement. It's important to recognize that feature of the text. But this then brings me to what I take to be one of the Declaration's most important lessons, and one that has been, for me, the hardest to come by. So democracies depend on compromise, right? Because without it, they'll just break. At the end of the day, those who are in the minority on a given position have to be able to go along with those in the majority. And if at the end of the day you can't find your way to compromises, livable, capacious solutions, then those who lose out have no reason to stay in the game at all. So without compromise, democracy is not a viable political form. Yet, we're not very good at compromising these days. It's become a weakness in our political practice. Why are we so bad at compromise? There are a lot of reasons, but I actually think that the slavery compromise is one of the reasons. None of us want to do that. None of us want to make that kind of mistake, compromise on a matter of core principle in a way that puts us on the wrong side of history. Which means we have to ask this really hard question. How do you tell the difference between good compromises and bad compromises? And can the Declaration help us to draw a distinction there? So that's where I come back again then to these two compromises, the religion compromise and the slavery compromise. I called the first a good compromise. I'll call the second a bad compromise. What makes the difference between them? Well, the religious compromise, in fact, took into consideration all of the different religious positions and experiences then in existence in the colonies. That is, all affected by the decision and choices of formulations were part of the deliberative process achieving the compromise. Now let's consider the slavery compromise. Were all affected included? Exactly. No, I don't think it would have come out as it did if all affected had been included in the decision making. Which means, as we're thinking about the foundation of principle we want for our society, we may have just discovered another one. That the way you can have compromise and avoid bad compromises is if you recognize inclusion, full inclusion of those affected by a decision-making process as fundamental to achieving a just outcome. Okay, interesting. So this is where then I get to thinking about our contemporary circumstances and the issue of immigration. We've got 11 million undocumented people in this country. Our politicians are hard at work, well, maybe, trying to come up with a solution to this problem. have we actually figured out how to include in the right ways the voices and perspectives of those who will be affected by our decision? Or are we in danger of making a decision or a compromise like the slavery compromise? There's 11 million people who've been working very hard in this country. Not all of them, I admit. Yes, there are people who do bad things, though we all know, right, that the crime rates of immigrants are lower than the crime rates of native-born Americans. So there's a whole lot of fire and noise and smoke being blown around about issues in inaccurate ways, right? 11 million people, most of whom working incredibly hard, who've brought a lot to this country, where there are confusing distinctions between the category of refugee and immigrant. Some people who are under an immigration category look like they're fleeing pretty desperate circumstances, particularly in Central America, which are, dare I say, of our making. If we stop to think about what the war on drugs has done to the legal regimes of Central and South America. It gets awfully tangled up. But, so for my own personal effort to think my way through the immigration question, I have come to believe that in order to address it fully, we have to figure out how to include the perspectives of the 11 million undocumented individuals in our conversations. Now you're bound to ask me exactly how to do that, and I don't have the answer. But that's why I came to CMC, where all these brilliant young people studying and working hard on these questions. So I think the charge I'm putting to you is, how do we even begin to design public conversations, public decision-making processes that ensure that those affected by the decisions that we're making have voices that are heard as part of our process? We do know how to include the voices of people who don't have formal citizenship, because we do it for children all the time. Now, I'm not drawing an analogy between children and immigrants, except for in a formal way, that is, that the legal status is related. And we would never think it appropriate to disregard entirely the experience of children, nor would we think it appropriate to empower them, strictly speaking, as voters on a given decision. But we find a way, nonetheless, of ensuring that their voices are part of the process. And so I think that's the hard question we have to work on as we struggle our way to understanding both what's the foundation of principle that we want to build on to shape the direction of our country, and how do we organize the powers of government, including achieving voice and representation, Abigail Adams' words she used at a point when women were not part of the political system. Nonetheless, she wanted voice and representation. How do we achieve that in our organizational forms now with regard to the issue of immigration? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We will now be opening it up to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and either Wesley or I will come and hand you the mic.
Okay. So thanks. I'd like to say that I particularly appreciated that, because it's not often that I find myself encouraged by or attracted to like more optimistic takes on, I guess, things in politics generally. So I really appreciated this. And related to that, I'm wondering what you might say to, okay, so specifically thinking that about in the second sentence where it says that the people have the right to either adapt, change, alter or abolish the present form of government. What do you say to people who think that it's already time to abolish, or perhaps when do we know it's just time to abolish rather than to alter? I'd love to hear either of your thoughts on those.
So the very next sentence of the Declaration says that government should never be changed for light and transient causes. In other words, they move directly from the right of revolution that they've just articulated to an account of the standard you have to meet in order to trigger the abolish provision as opposed to the altering one. And so what does it mean to sort through whether or not reasons or causes are light and transient? For them, what it meant was they could point to a record of 10 years of concerted effort in petitioning the king, laying out alternative policy proposals, and so forth. And it was because they had been consistently working and gotten no response, no movement whatsoever, that they decided that they had reached that point. So that was the justification that they offered. In our own circumstances, there are all kinds of different issues people are working hard on and concerned about. The ones that I know the most about, things like criminal justice reform, for example, healthcare, among others. In each case, if you take criminal justice reform, that's an area where most of the work that needs to be done is on the state level, not the federal level. The majority of the operations of our criminal justice system are organized by state law, and few people participate in state politics these days. So there has not been a concerted effort to redirect our state laws. So that's just one area of policy, but that's how you think about it, right? You have to sort of figure out, well, what are the actual avenues of change, and has a fully concerted effort on all dimensions been made over an extended stretch of time that one could point to as a historical record in order to justify a decision of a certain kind. But just to say, at the same time, I mean, you've put your finger on one of the paradoxes of the American founding, which is that it's sort of insane to aspire to build a new and durable government on a principle of revolution, right? The sort of paradox built into the heart of the thing. But that, then again, is why practices of citizenship are so important in understanding effective citizenship. I think that there is huge amounts of room for alteration inside our current institutions, and that's what I'm trying to help people see.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask about your definition of good versus bad compromise. You argue that a good compromise is one which included the perspectives of all those relevant at the time, or sort of present at the time. I wanted to ask how you might apply that to queer rights. The identity of gayness, of course, did not exist at the time, and so some perhaps necessarily gay perspectives could not have been included because the definition did not exist. Like we existed, but our identity did not exist. So how then would you go, or would you have a project of constructing gay rights off of the Declaration, or would you see it as having to be added separately? Thank you.
Thanks. No, I think I would say something similar to what I said about gender and race, that the phrase all men was intended in a universalizing way, that the errors that they made came in how they thought about how to organize the powers of government. And so I see our responsibility as being a matter of understanding how to structure the powers of government to make good on the idea that all people have rights, and those rights need to be secured by their government. And that it's our job to give those rights definition. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is a starting point for that conversation. Over the course of the 20th century, the right to association was added. So for example, we put a lot of emphasis now on the right to association as a core right. That right wasn't formulated until Supreme Court jurisprudence in the middle of the 20th century, which people don't often realize. And then on that right of association, we've built a right to marriage. Marriage is a form of association, right? So that's an example of how in our Supreme Court jurisprudence, we've been extending the conversation about basic principles over time under the penumbra of our rights discourse.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was particularly struck as well by your distinction between good and bad compromises. And I was curious, we've seen so many compromises being made in Washington right now, both good and bad. Do you think there's maybe some mechanism we can put in place to better encourage good compromise while discouraging bad compromise?
Yes. And it's called the Fair Representation Act, which has been put forward by a member of Congress from Virginia. And what it proposes is to convert to an electoral structure for Congress that consists of multi-member districts and rank order voting. And what this would result in is that the majority of congressional districts in the country would be represented by both a Democrat and a Republican, or some, they would have a group of representatives who would represent both parties. Because the way rank order voting works is if your first choice doesn't make it past the post, your vote goes down to your next choice and so forth. And if you've got multi-members, then you'll end up with some members representing the majority and some representing the minority. That would mean that any given congressional district would be represented by people from different parties would have the same constituency. And they'd have to figure out together how to serve their constituency, right? So I think that the work of compromise is partly a matter of the ethics we bring to politics, but it's also a matter of our institutional structures and the kinds of incentives that are designed into them. And I do think that we need to redesign our institutions to some degree. The proposals I've just mentioned isn't radical. So how congressional elections are handled is controlled by Congress. It's not even a matter of constitutional, doesn't rise to the level of the Constitution. And these modes of voting have been used in the US at different points in time in different parts of the country. So it's well within the realm of the imaginable, doable sort of political reform.
Thanks for speaking with us. When most of us think about the Declaration of Independence, I think we make an assumption that it's a document about here are all the tyrannical things that the state may not do. But you expressed how, especially for Adams, the motivation of the political philosophy was the idea that the government can actively promote happiness and that state action might advance the national interest in beneficial ways. So for you, is the Declaration of Independence a fundamentally deontological document about natural rights, or is it a consequentialist document about advancing utility, or somewhere in between?
Oh, I love it. Thank you. Alrighty. See, I told you I was coming to CMC to the place where I'd get hard questions and good answers on hard questions that I'm also posing to you. So I would say it's neither. So I think it's a pragmatist document in the sense of the American philosophical tradition of pragmatism. Also politically pragmatic, but the pragmatism matters. And let me explain how that works. So that sentence is really incredibly important, and it's one that has predecessors in the previous 15 years of American politics. So actually, John Adams wrote a version of that sentence in January in a proclamation he wrote for Massachusetts. And John Wilson, 10 years earlier, had written a version of the sentence. So they've been like noodling on the question of how to define this thing they're doing, and it crystallizes finally in Jefferson's formulation. But it's been coming together. And the key part of it is, there's two parts that are key. One, simply the recognition that human beings are purposive, and we pursue happiness, all right? That every day we're trying to make today better than yesterday. It's very basic. We all have this. It's a thing that makes us equal. It is the feature of our equality. And that human history has shown that we've been building these institutions, governments, to help us do that. But so then the second important part, so A, human beings are purposive. B, it's the right of the people to figure out how to secure their safety and happiness. Now, there's a really important idea buried in that that's hard to get to. It gets more fully articulated by Mill later. But the idea is that only the people for themselves can judge whether things are going well for them or not. For us, each of us individually, and for the people together. By that I mean, although each of us makes all kinds of bad decisions, and we all know people who make a lot of bad decisions consistently, it is still true that each of us has better access to what's good for us, what we're trying to be, what our purposes are, than any other human being could possibly have. So there is no other person who can do a better job for us than we have the potential to do for ourselves in setting our own direction. That's the key insight in the end of that sentence. You put those things together, human purposiveness, and the fact that each of us is best positioned to be the judge of our own purposes, and you get the core elements of pragmatism, all right? So we're seeking something that we'll loosely call happiness, and then we have to judge repeatedly whether we've gotten it. But all we can do is make a prediction about what's most likely to get it for us, which means we also always have to be prepared to correct ourselves. So there's a certain kind of what people call fallibilism and corrigibilism built into that. All right, so that's it. A loose conception of human flourishing, that's what keeps it from being deontological. It's too open-ended. And then it's about our judgment in relationship to our flourishing. And that is what keeps it from being utilitarian, because it's not just a sort of straight mathematical principle about a kind of aggregate good. It's what each of us individually has to judge. And over time, as we correct and so forth, we improve. And so that bundle of things with the fallibilism and corrigibilism is what gives you the package that people call pragmatism. All righty?
Thank you very much for your talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You talked a lot about the second sentence in the Declaration, and that sentence talks a lot about rights, of which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the right to displace a government if it is not fulfilling those its obligations. But implicit at the end is, I guess, an obligation to ascertain or reflect on what is most likely to bring people safety and happiness, and the safety and happiness of your fellow citizens. Nowadays, in a lot of countries, you see that people are forced into those obligations. In Singapore, in Israel, in South Korea, people are forced to consider the safety of their fellow citizens and are obliged to some form of national service or something of that sort. And in other developed democracies, you, I feel, see, correct me if I'm wrong, but a loss in a recognition that we have an obligation to our fellow citizens. How do you cultivate feelings of obligations to fellow citizens in order to cultivate a more civic community?
So I'm going to answer the question by turning it upside down, if you'll permit me. So when you asked the great question of how do you cultivate a sense of obligation to fellow citizens, by turning it upside down, I mean, you could ask the question, how do we avoid cultivating a sense of enmity amongst ourselves? Okay? Now, when I turn the question upside down like that, I'm actually asking James Madison's question about faction. So we talk a lot about polarization these days and partisanship. You know, we could call it faction. Now, the reason it's worth turning the question around that way is because at the founding, they put an awful lot of thought into the problem of faction and how to dissolve it or mitigate it. And it's important to think back to their answers because they don't work anymore. And I want to be very clear about why they don't work, because then you'll get the answer to the question you started with, okay? So if you go back to Federalist 10, that's the important instance of the Federalist Papers, where Madison takes up the question of how in this big diverse country where you're going to have all these different kinds of interests and point of view, the whole thing won't just disintegrate into dangerous factionalism or minority factions that can tyrannize the majority and things like that. And there are two parts to his answer. People tend to focus on the part that is about representative institutions. The argument is that you'll have these representatives who are elected from the different parts of the country, and they'll filter opinions and give us a more moderate set of opinions for actual decision making. Right? That's part of the answer. People miss that the other part of his answer is that the actual geographic dispersal of the country will contribute to resolving the problem of faction. So the way the argument goes is that people will be so spread out and hindered by mountains and rivers and things like that, that it will be very hard for people with extreme views to combine with each other. And when you put that fact together with the representative system, so then it's hard for people with extreme views to actually find each other and combine, and so the extreme views really do get filtered through representatives who have a moderating impact and can then bring together a national conversation. You can see where I'm going with these points, right? It doesn't, like that, the geographic premise of the design doesn't hold. It's gone, okay? So that's why it's not working, people. So if we want to fix it, we actually have to revisit the basic questions of institutional design. That's why I raised the Fair Representation Act as one possible alternative approach to institutional design. There are others. I'm actually a supporter of national service for a related reason. Yeah, complicated, possibly volunteering alongside military service, et cetera. You still get some self-selection. Anyway, I'm a supporter of geographic lotteries for college admission. Anyway, I like to put these things out there because the point is that we can redesign our institutions, and we actually need to redesign them because, again, that original premise doesn't hold. And so, but the point is that then if you can redesign the institutions so the incentive is to compromise and cooperation, you'll start to get a culture that is about remembering again, learning again what our obligations are to one another. So we get back to that culture by undoing the problem of faction through institutional design. That's the argument.
Hello, I had a question. Is visibility a requirement for democracy? In the case of undocumented immigrants, I find that visibility and representation can often be coercive and even unethical, as the state apparatus brutalizes immigrants for their visibility. We can see this particularly in the case of migrant rights activists getting targeted for being public about their status, among many other examples. So is visibility as a method towards inclusion for you a concept that is absolutely necessary for democracy? In that case, I would think that detention and deportation policies would have to be extensively reworked so that people actually feel safe to be visible. Or can undocumented immigrants practice inclusion or engaging in a social citizenship within democracy without visibility?
Thank you. That's a good question. So at the end of the day, voice and representation require visibility of some kind, but I think that there are different ways of approaching that in different contexts, and I think there's room for voice and representation by proxy, right? And so, I think you're asking, your challenge is there are two different kinds. So there's the issue of undocumented workers or members of our society who are at great risk if they expose themselves. There's a separate issue of people with permanent status, whether citizen or otherwise, who are allies and working on behalf of immigrants' rights issues and who are nonetheless harassed or made vulnerable. I think in the latter case, it's incumbent on a bigger group of citizens to be working on behalf of strong legal protections for activists working in that space, right? So that's one issue, and I think that one is one can think about within the parameters of our existing ways of thinking about issues of protest and activism and things like that. The Dreamers case is a particularly interesting one, as I'm sure you know, because the very fact that there was protection of any kind achieved did depend on the amazing bravery of a campaign of young dreamers, right, who defined themselves that way, mounted a campaign of coming out videos and so forth. And if you look at the kind of policy sort of record at the state levels, it's a complicated story. So you see a combination of both great gains, but also really strong backlash. So you can tell I don't have an answer to your question. I'm just sort of thinking out loud with you. There's no question about the dangers involved in this. But from my point of view, what those dangers really do is point to the problem of statelessness, which is a problem that Hannah Arendt wrote about a long time ago. What it means for people to be stateless is to be thoroughly exposed and no protections of the most basic human rights. And so from my point of view, the conversations that we have in this space should begin with the notion that every human being has a right to be a citizen in some state, and that no person should be exposed to statelessness. Now, for me to say that doesn't get us very far because I'm one person and that doesn't yield much protection, but that's the kind of case I think we should be making in order to secure some basic human rights protections.
Hey, thank you for coming. I'm interested in the Fair Representation Act and the idea of multi-member districts. I think it would, be more fair in general, but it also would probably give more power to people who are now Democratic Party, and so people who are now Republicans might seek to undo it. Would you hope that that kind of a compromise would just work out so well that everyone would be happy in the end, or how would you think that that kind of thing can be sustained? Because there's been reactions in our history to those kinds of changes.
So it's interesting. I don't think I had that take on its favoring Democrats ultimately. There are all kinds of places where it would give Republicans more of a voice than they currently have. So in most blue states, it would increase the influence of Republicans, for example, and conversely in red states. So, we probably have a different sort of empirical sense of what would happen. So given that, let's talk afterwards. You should share with me where you get your line from, and I'll see what I can figure out.
Thank you for being here tonight. In your chat, you talked about kind of the nature of citizenship as the nation was being forged and a national identity was being found. And at a time when people, I think, are rightly kind of cognizant and wary of terms like nationalism, how do you kind of deal with the relationship between national identity and citizenship?
Oh gosh, that's an interesting question. Would it be fair to say your question is also a question about patriotism? Yeah, alrighty. Well, I'm just trying to understand the question. It's funny. I don't know why. I don't think about it that way. So let's see. Yeah, I don't know. It's so funny. I guess I don't think about it that way because the relevant terms of membership that I'm focused on and am articulating have to do with a set of ideals and institutions. And so that is connected to a specific tradition of a specific place, specific country, the United States of America, and so forth. And so the argument that I'm making is one for pride in that history and those traditions. And I guess the reason I don't, I tend to use the word nationalism, I don't tend to connect it to my line of thought, has to do with the different kinds of meanings and traditions behind the concept of nationalism. So what I'm trying to say exactly, I suppose, is just that at the end of the day, I focus on the concept of the people, and a people bound by a set of commitments, and therefore with a kind of open-endedness to who can participate in that and in the cultural fabric. So insofar as nation concepts have tended to connect to cultural communities, I tend to think of that as a different conversation, to be honest. That probably sounds very strange, but that's the case. That is, yeah, that's the case. So for me, patriotism is about these ideals, these institutions, and the strength and prosperity of a political community glued together by them. Sorry, I know I've missed the force of the question, but that's nobody's done that to me in a long time. Sorry. No, can you say a little bit more? Do you mind saying a bit more about your question? I'm sorry, no, I want to understand a little bit better what you think the stakes are of putting those things in relationship to each other.
I think nationalism is a really kind of charged term that a lot of people are afraid of. But I think there's an idea there that I think you got at, that it's really important, right? Kind of a buy-in to shared values and some sort of identity. And the fear comes when it's cultural or when it's associated with a specific group of people. I think that kind of sense of nationalism has really been used in a bad way for kind of throughout history, but to me there's a value there. I think you pointed out with the term patriotism that I think I might be considering kind of the plus side of nationalism that I would consider kind of vital and necessary if you're gonna have the kind of citizenship you're talking about.
Okay, so that's it. So thank you, that was very helpful. So I think that's exactly what's going on, is that the concept of nationalism doesn't in itself convey anything about ideals and institutions. And as such, I think it actually doesn't help us understand our own traditions. I think that's what I'm getting at.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. I'm actually one of Professor John Sirius' students at Pomona College. So I've read both of your books.
I think, yes, and we've met before, haven't we?
Yeah, we met before.
Already, nice to see you.
So great to see you again. So my question is actually more of the international law, international human rights question, which is not really the domestic focus right here. But I was wondering, so there's currently talks on how there's a proliferation of rights, of human rights on this international scale. And what do you see sort of that the US Declaration framing process and the document itself, how does it help, say, like, guide our thinking in international human rights and that kind of proliferation we're talking about here?
So, I mean, the history of rights is fascinating, and there's been a lot of change since the U.S. Declaration up to the UN Declaration of Human Rights and so forth, and even from the U.S. Declaration to the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, there's already a change. So the U.S. Declaration of Independence really focuses on the concept, for example, of political equality and the political rights that are attached to that. The French Declaration begins to introduce a concept of economic rights. By the time we get up to the UN Declaration, we've got cultural rights, social rights of education, health, and so forth, alongside political rights. And I think the result of that is we have a different kind of intellectual challenge now than 200 years ago. One way I like to put the nature of the challenge is, if I invoke the concept of equality, you shouldn't let me stop there. You should ask the question of what kind of equality I'm talking about. Am I talking about human moral equality? Am I talking about political equality? Am I talking about social equality? Am I talking about economic issues, certain kind of economic egalitarianism? Am I talking about gender equality or racial equality, or many different kinds of things I might be talking about. And in order to think about the ways in which bundles of rights interact with each other, I think we have to think about how those different kinds of equality interact with each other. It's my own view that in our policy-making landscape for the last 50 years, political equality has fallen too far down the list of important kinds of equality, and that consequently sort of political rights have fallen too far down the list of what we should be paying attention to. So in my book and in my arguments generally, part of what you're getting is an argument for rebalancing in favor of political equality and political rights in relationship to other categories of rights. Amartya Sen is a philosopher and economist whose work I much admire, and I follow his line of argument that in some sense, political freedom is fundamental to achieving a bundle of goods that support human capacities. So to argue for rebalancing in favor of political rights and political equality is not to put issues of material well-being sort of off the table altogether, but it is to make the argument that we get to shared prosperity through free political institutions and political freedom.
Hi again.
Hello.
So I've been having a difficult time trying to figure out how to articulate the question, and I think it might be because part of the problem might be that it's actually outside the scope of what you're talking about. But I'm thinking about the notion of... Fair enough, then I'll feel comfortable. So I'm thinking about the notion of good compromise as being compromises which include in the discussion all of the people who are affected by the decision. But then having that in mind alongside concerns and considerations about polarization and a lack of, as was mentioned, the sense of obligation to our citizenry. And it makes me wonder about the kinds of things, irrespective of the quality of the compromise with respect to inclusiveness and involvement in the decision making, the kinds of things which ought not to be compromised on if those things exist. If so, how do we go about still talking about them? And then if not, how do we go about convincing ourselves and each other that there's nothing we can't compromise on?
Right, okay, so I'm going to separate the question into two different parts. Your second question, is there anything we can't compromise on implicitly? And a question about how we actually work through the very hard conversations that are about issues that at some level we start by thinking we can't compromise on. So yes, I think there are things that we can't compromise on, right? So and I won't enumerate those now, but I do take those sort of basic principles of equality to be a starting point for understanding where those things are. So to say that there's a distinct difference between good and bad compromises doesn't mean that there aren't limits to the zone for compromise. I mean, there have to be limits. There have to be places where you decide it's time to fight. I mean, that's just, human life teaches that lesson. But in terms of, I think what I'm hearing in your question, so you should tell me if I'm getting you wrong. What I'm hearing in your question is partly a question about hard conversations on college campuses. No? Oh. All right. Okay. Well, then I don't think so. What I was hearing was the challenge of for example, our debates about free speech and academic freedom and things like that, and those points where one side thinks the other side is making an argument that should be one that we don't compromise on, it shouldn't even be articulated. So that was the kind of issue I was hearing.
Yeah, I think that actually. Oh, it's back on, thank you. I think you're right to say that that's related. It just wasn't what I had in mind because I'm exhausted of that conversation.
Got it.
But, I mean, just stretching it like off of college campuses, I guess, similarly, conversations with colleagues, family members, people in the same political sphere,
Right.
just about, how we vote or what we think, et cetera.
So I see. Okay, so it's a big field. Okay, nonetheless, I'm going to try to speak to the college campus piece of it on the idea that things we might say about that can also be extended to other contexts. Alrighty. So the thing that's distinctive about the college campus is that doing the work that we do here depends on academic freedom. And so that's a bit different from a marriage, a friendship, et cetera. The kinds of relationships where you don't say absolutely everything you think because you'd ruin it, right? So, but college campuses depend on academic freedom. And that means being on a college campus is partly about figuring out how to live through really hard, bad arguments. But I think we also, one of the goals of developing cultures where compromise is possible is about recognizing a responsibility to prove oneself trustworthy to the other members of one's community. And the need to prove oneself trustworthy begins to set the parameters on how one behaves, how one thinks about what one's going to say. And that doesn't set parameters on one's views, but it means it sets parameters on how one goes about thinking about articulating one's views. So then I think that leads to needing to recognize distinctions among the kinds of ways in which speech can do harm or show that you're not trustworthy. There are the easy cases, right, of slander and libel and defamation and threat and slurs and harassment. We actually have huge numbers of legal categories for dealing with those things. Those are easy. And then there are two hard categories. There's the accidentally insulting category, right, which is just doesn't do anybody any good to cause accidental insult or to be accidentally insulted. And that's a place where I think we just, as a part of proving ourselves trustworthy to each other, have a responsibility to show each other where those places are so that well-intentioned people can avoid them. And that doesn't mean you need elaborate policies. It just means you need a culture of expecting to prove yourself trustworthy and being willing to hear, oh, that was insulting. Oh, I didn't intend it. Okay, on we go. Okay, we've clarified, there's a little accidental insult happening in that space. We can do better than that. The hardest part is the part where you've got arguments or views that some group or party will consider existentially threatening. So the immigration debate is a good example there, right? I mean, so there are various positions, acceptable positions on our political spectrum that are existentially threatening to some members of a college community. So how do we approach articulating views when they're existentially threatening to other people? Another example would be my book on the Declaration of Independence. I'm very critical of libertarianism in a way that you could consider being a sort of straw man representation of libertarianism. And as the author of the book, I have to recognize that a libertarian might consider my book existentially threatening, right? So what's my responsibility in relationship to that? How do I prove myself trustworthy? I have to convey my commitment to that person's well-being in the community. This is on a college campus. And so then it's a question of how one approaches articulating one's views. And I think this applies across the political spectrum, but I do think a basic part of meeting one's obligations as a member of a community is about proving oneself trustworthy to others, and therefore requires one to work through the question of how to convey existentially threatening views in ways that nonetheless prove your trustworthiness. Yeah. You don't buy it. That's true. That's true. It is a tall order, but I think for me that's what we're here for on college campuses, is this is the place where we have the opportunity, the space, the privilege of trying to make the most of ourselves, including in this zone of figuring out those points where we feel like we're in existential conflict with each other and figuring out how to live through them, move through them to another place.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. It's been one of my favorite talks I've ever been to, so thank you.
Oh my.
I just wanted to push back on one of the responses you gave earlier to a question, which is that each individual is most able to identify their own interests. And I would agree with you in terms of when those principles that we all share are being violated. But then I'm quite pessimistic about the ability of each person to determine which policy apparatus or set of institutions can then best address their grievances. I think the recent election is a great evidence of that. So in Gov20, where we read your book, but we also read Tocqueville, he addresses this distinction by saying that it's better to have a well-intentioned but untrained politician advocate for these interests as opposed to a malintentioned but well-trained politician. How do you kind of address that nuance and trade-off?
So that's a great question, thank you. So there are two different, or let me say, there are three different judgments at stake here. There is a judgment of an individual about his or her own course of life. There's a judgment of each individual about the collective course. And then there are the judgments made through our political institutions by representatives. The judgments of individuals about our collective course in a representative democracy typically get exercised through the selection of representatives, right? So at the end of the day, we end up having to make kind of proxy decisions for a set of potential policy views. Now, the important point is that the judgment of individuals and the people is the ground in those first two cases. And then the third type of judgment, the judgments made through our political institutions, are what I would call an epistemic problem. That is, it's a question of how you combine the different kinds of knowledge and insight in a community into a shared judgment. And there, I would agree with you. I mean, I think, yes, it's a matter of combining expertise with the knowledge of lay individual about how a given policy plays out in their community. So, it's the view that I've articulated about individuals' special position in relationship to their own well-being results in a view about political decision-making where you would never toss it over to the experts alone, but that you're always building your institutions in order to integrate expert knowledge built up in particular policy arenas with the judgments people are making about core values, broad directions that they want to set for society.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have this evening. Please remember that we are selling our declaration outside, and please join me in one more time thanking Professor Allen.
Thank you.